This video is sponsored by Adept Roll. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're doing a little bit of a different version of the best armies in Warhammer 40k. This is normally the video series where we release on Mondays and analyze the weekend's results, although this weekend is a little bit different because we have so many new releases for 40k that many of the events that took place this weekend did not use the current rule set. So instead of doing a normal video, we're going to be going through 3 events in detail that used the most updated Munitorum field manual as well as data slate update and talk about the winning lists and their paths to victory. As always with these videos, I want to thank everyone who supports TacticalTortoise either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. You can join in the link down below the video or obviously over on my Twitch channel where I stream 40k gameplay almost every weekday. And not only them, but also our video sponsor. This video is sponsored by Adept Roll. Are you tired of guessing whether or not your 40k game plan will pay off? Well, guess no more. I'm happy to introduce Adept Roll, a dice probability calculator usable on basically any mobile device. For those who haven't used these tools before, they offer a very simple plug-in system where you can input your weapon stats versus defending stats and calculate the probabilities of certain dice results or the average amount of damage that you should expect from a particular attack sequence. Adept Roll is a mobile app designed to give you precise calculations on probabilities for these attacks. It saves you the time and effort of doing the complex math and allows you to focus more heavily on actually outplaying your opponent on the battlefield. I myself use these tools quite often in my games of 40k, especially if I'm identifying 2 lines of play.
Curious what the math hammer is. According to this, the average damage is 3.
Adept Roll features a new and improved profile importer that allows you to add unit profiles from any faction in Warhammer 40k to your app for easy analysis and customize them to your exact configuration. So take control of your 40k battles with more powerful dice insight and download Adept Roll for free on iOS or Android by following the links down in the video description. Now we're going to start relatively small here and talk about the Great 2000 Bash held in Walkerville, Queensland, down in Australia. This was a relatively small 40k event, only about 20 players, but did run 5 rounds and did get to a single undefeated. Now the list doesn't have a player name on it. The player name that was registered is Me and the Boys, which makes a lot of sense being an orc list, but I don't know exactly the human player behind it. That said, this list was running an Ork War Horde. This was led by a beast boss with cunning but brutal, a Deathkiller Wartrike with super cyborg body, Gaskell Thraka, as well as 2 war bosses. Those war bosses do have a newly increased points value, so we are playing a couple points down from where the faction was previously. Now, with that being the case, we did see that huge update to the Ork faction ability. They can now declare a WA in their own command phase rather than the start of a battle round. So units like these war bosses and Gaskell Thraka that are able to both gain and project huge buffs on the WA turn, with Gaskell Thraka's WA banner projecting a lethal hits aura, as well as Gaz himself improving his own critical hits, and war bosses gaining a huge boatload of additional attacks. These guys are going to be able to use their abilities a lot more proactively. We have a unit of Beast Snagga Boys as well as a 20 model Boys squad in the battle line, like putting the Beast Boss into the Beast Snagga Boys and likely attaching one of the War Bosses into the Standard Boy Squad. That's followed up by a pair of trucks to carry some of these guys around the table, and a battle wagon with an Ard case to carry the 20 model boys around. But obviously, with that Ard case, it is going to be a little bit too short to carry Gaskell Thraka himself. With that as well, we also have a unit of Burna Boys. These guys are pretty nice for their ability to trade up into enemy utility units. They can reroll their wound rolls on objectives and generally have a pretty solid damage output into enemy infantry and are incredibly efficient at only 60 points for the unit. We also have a unit of Death Coptas to add some speed, 2 units of Flash Gits for shooting, 2 units of Gretchen for utility and to generate CP on the backline objective, a single kill rig to not only buff up the battle line with additional strength, but also carry those Beast Snagga boys into the fight, a Mega Knobs unit to attach into Gaskell Thraka. That's important because his leadership ability is absolutely massive, and without any Mega Knobs attached in with him, he's not going to get the benefit of that. They get a little bit of a benefit from Gaskell himself, but mostly they're there to allow him to give himself his buffs. We have a place for that last war boss with a unit of 5 knobs, as well as a unit of 4 Squighog boys. Now, the event ran 6 rounds, and this list went undefeated through all 6 of them. And I'd like to talk about the matchups that it played on its way to the podium. Now, I will preface this by saying that the scores, at least for this list, were pretty wild. A lot of them were severely depressed, being very low scoring games. First of all, that's not particularly consistent with how orcs play. Orcs tend to play aggressively and often tend to outscore their opponent if they're winning, or get outscored themselves if they're losing. Aggressive armies like orcs tend to have these pretty swingy scores. However, all of these wins were relatively low. I think this speaks to the fact that this list might have gone to time in several rounds, which, if true, is unfortunate. It also, it seems like, got the bye 1 round, or potentially a concession, because it was paired up against a dropped player whose faction I can't access. So with that, it did get a round 1 35-12 win against Leagues of Votann. It took down Imperial Knights in round 2, 42-34. Round 3 was the aforementioned drop game, so I'm not sure who it played against because the player is no longer registered in the event. Round 4, it took down Black Templars 34-20 and got a similar result against Ultramarines in round 5, 36-24. I do think that orcs actually have a little bit of an interesting interaction with the new Ultramarines that I think are going to be incredibly meta moving on into the upcoming season, because they tend to use transport mechanics in lots of smaller units rather than large, tanky bricks. Large bricks are susceptible to Oaths of Moment, where your opponent is getting reroll hits, +1 to wound, and potentially other effects like wound rerolls from Starnguard veterans when targeting you, but orcs don't really have many of those. In this list, we have Gaskell Thraka's unit, as well as a 20-man of Orc boys, but that's about it, so Space Marines don't have too much to sink their teeth into. As we see orc lists develop in this new season and introduce some of the new data sheets and potentially the new detachment they have access to, we may see them skew towards a little bit more of an MSU style, where they take smaller units of 5 or 6 models, as well as light transports like trucks, and really dodge these big heavy hitters that the opponent can bring to bear against them, while potentially trading up with the WA that they can now call whenever they want to. The last round of the event saw this orc list up against Chaos Demons, where it won 45-37. Orcs do tend to be fairly good into Chaos Demons, which have a tough time fighting against dedicated transports, and also, given the fact that orcs tend to have a high volume of very effective low AP attacks, they can punch into invulnerable saves fairly well, and without any armor to protect them, demons are incredibly susceptible to this. But that left the list at 6-0, and orcs with a GT win for the week. With that, let's move over to the United States and talk about something a little bit more chaotic. The other 2 lists that we're going to be discussing today are both Chaos Space Marine varieties, both piloted by incredibly strong players. The first one we'll talk about, moving up in the population of these events, is a 36-player Winter Wars Hybrid GT held in Coropolis, Pennsylvania. This was held at the Fabricators Forge Gaming Club and was an interesting format. The hybrid nature meant that you could play it as a single-day RTT if you wanted to, but if you paid an additional entry fee, you could play the second day as well, making it a true GT. This allowed additional players to play or drop out without feeling obligated to keep playing throughout all 5 rounds if they weren't enjoying the updated format. The event was won by TJ Lanigan, running Thousand Suns. TJ is running Ahriman, an Exalted Sorcerer on a Disc of Tzeentch, as well as with Lord of Forbidden Lore, as well as 2 Infernal Masters, one with Arcane Vortex to buff his psychic attacks, one with the Umberlific Crystal to allow him to redeploy once per game, chosen in your command phase. Magnus the Red was also there, as well as a standard Thousand Sun Sorcerer. I think these guys are going to be a lot more common now that there is the potential of Space Marine Indirect coming back into the metagame. The Thousand Sun Sorcerer protects his unit from being targeted by enemies from greater than 18 inches away, so his unit is entirely immune to such indirect fire at long ranges. Using that in a combination with reserve rules as well as dedicated transports like Rhinos can keep the squishy Rubric Marines safe in the early game against the styles of artillery lists. We also saw 3 units of Rubric Rubric Marines. Those are 5 models each, equipped with a combination of Warp Flamers and Soul Reaper cannons. We saw 2 Mutalith Vortex Beasts, as well as 2 units of Zangor Enlightened, and 2 units of Cultists. This is a fairly standard build of Thousand Suns, but one thing that might be interesting is as we see armies like Marines get some more play, armies like Thousand Suns that have the capacity to punish high armor save units may actually see an uptick. Marines was always a little bit of a beneficial matchup for Thousand Suns, and so as they become more popular, we may see Thousand Suns rise back to at least a shadow of their former glory. And with that, let's talk about the players that TJ played on his way to the top here. That started with an 80-54 win against World Eaters. Following that up was another win against another Chaos Space Marine faction, a little bit of a theme here, and another one that focuses on those armor saves. That was a 90-60 win against Death Guard. With the maneuverability of Thousand Suns, they can definitely run circles around Death Guard, especially ones that are focusing on the new builds, trying to take bricks of Terminators. That moved us on to a 85-52 win against Space Wolves. Another 85-point win, 85-62 this time, against Genestealer Cults, and that put TJ into the finals in what is, humorously, a mirror match against Malachi Fowler, also running Thousand Suns. That came down to a 15-point differential between the two, 80-65, in favor of TJ's Thousand Suns, although the two lists were incredibly similar, with Malachi's list focusing on some larger units of Rubric Marines to utilize their slightly more efficient points value per model, whereas we had a little bit more of an MSU build from TJ. Those additional units likely allowed TJ to play the scenario a little bit harder, and in mirror matches like this, oftentimes the roll to go first or second can be very impactful because it allows you to either alpha strike your opponent, or similarly allows for bottom of round 5 scoring to get a leg up on your opponent. In any case, that allowed TJ to go 5-0 and take down the event. And that puts us to our last event. Also on the east coast of the US, this one was the Charity GT by Rogue State Games, held in Mahwah, New Jersey. This was a relatively large GT at 51 players to benefit the National Federation of the Blind. In an additional theme, this event was also won by Chaos Space Marines, this time by Anthony Vanella. Unlike the other events we talked about today, this event also allowed the Grotsmas detachments to be played, so we got to see some spicy matchup. And in this case, the winner was actually playing one of those Grotsmas detachments. Anthony was playing a Chaos Space Marine list running Creations of Bile, the new experiment and Bile-focused detachment from the Grotsmas drop. For those who don't know, this detachment has a ton of buffs for melee-oriented Chaos Space Marine builds. It can unlock a series of experimental mutations for your army at the beginning of the game, which include such effects as additional attacks, additional movement, additional weapon skill, or strength to melee weapons, which can force very aggressive melee-oriented Chaos Space Marine units absolutely through the roof in terms of their damage output. You combine that with a series of stratagems like a 1 CP fight on death, the ability to regenerate models back to your unit for some additional potential threat range, and the ability for 1 CP to advance and charge, and all of these very powerful melee units are going to be clearing across the table and doing absolutely insane damage. So, what do we have in the list? First off, we have a Chaos Lord with Prime Test Subject. This is an expensive 35-point enhancement that gives the character +1 damage in melee, as well as full hit rerolls in melee. This is on a Chaos Lord with a Demon Hammer, so this can combo with his already very powerful +1 damage once per game effect, and especially if he's attached into a unit like Legionaries, he can reroll his wound rolls when targeting enemies on objectives, and also reroll his hit rolls naturally. Given the fact that he is a Chaos Space Marine and can perform Dark Pacts, that also potentially allows him to roll additional lethal or sustained hits over the course of his attack sequence. This guy, with this enhancement, costs a lot of points, 125 for just that character, but does some immense damage. We also saw Fabius Bile as the Army's Warlord. He allows you to re-roll your mutation rolls that you roll for the army at the start of the game, in addition to being an incredibly strong unit himself who can buff up his unit with additional statistical improvements and is incredibly hard to kill personally. So you'd be hard-pressed to find a Creations of Bile army that doesn't include the titular character himself. We also then have Cypher to act as a lone operative and a CP tax aura. Following that up, we had a unit of Chaos Cultists to act as utility, 2 units of 5 Legionaries, as well as 3 Chaos Rhinos. The Chaos Rhinos were carrying a combination of those legionaries, a unit of 5 chosen, as well as a unit of 10 chosen, and we are seeing all the new stuff in here because we had a Nemesis Claw. I have a whole datasheet deep dive on the Nemesis Claw and exactly how you can get the most out of this insane Night Lords unit. But for a long story short, these guys get additional benefits when attacking enemies that have taken casualties earlier on in the game, and also prevent enemies from using stratagems while engaging them. The big thing here is that when you're playing an aggressive army like Creations of Bile, you don't want your opponent to be able to use things like Armor of Contempt or other defensive stratagems to protect themselves from the immense numbers of attacks that your individual units can throw down, but also you don't want your opponents to do things like interrupt, and when a Nemesis Claw is engaging you, you're not allowed to. While these guys aren't great in every single list, they're an incredible tech piece in aggressive armies like this. We also then saw 2 units of 10 Possessed. The Possessed already have pretty above average stats in almost every category. They do a lot of damage in melee, they're fast, and they're relatively tough to kill, and when any of those 2 things are buffed from the mutations gained at the start of the game by the Creations of Bile detachment ability, these guys can be sent absolutely through the roof. I think a lot of Creations of Bile armies are going to be focused on these Possessed units, being potentially +2 speed, able to regenerate models back into your unit from the back to the front in order to get additional movement up the table, as well as being able to advance and charge for 1 CP gives these guys a massive threat range that can then be buffed by any additional statistical improvements that they might have unlocked. To add a little bit of shooting to the army, we also saw 2 War Dog Huntsmen. The Huntsman is an interesting War Dog variety. They come with a Reaper Chain Talon, so they have a little bit of melee output if you need them to. They're also just the standard War Dog profile, so they're high OC battle line units if you ever need those. But when they attack monsters or vehicles with either melee or ranged attacks, they get reroll 1s to wound and damage. With the constant cost increases that we see to kind of over-tuned datasheets like the War Dog Brigand, the War Dog Huntsman I think is coming, the War Dog Huntsman is slowly coming into vogue thanks to the fact that it's simply cheaper than those other War Dog varieties. Having a little bit of redundancy with those wound and damage rerolls is nice as well, since these guys mostly want to be keeping enemy tanks with their heads down by threatening them with some pretty solid firepower, even though they typically need to get within close range to be able to really trade into enemy heavy armor. Now, this event used differential scoring, so I don't know the exact results of all of Anthony's games this time around, although I do know that he beat all of his opponents by at least 50 points, because in that differential scoring system, he got 5 consecutive 20-0 victories. For aggressive armies like this, as I mentioned before with orcs, they typically tend to be relatively high scoring, and if you can outplay your opponent quickly, you can often leverage that into a big win for these huge tiebreakers. Now, in terms of the armies that he played against over the course of the event, Anthony was able to take down Blood Angels in round 1, following that up with a defeat of Dark Angels in round 2, just taking names of these new Space Marine chapters. Speaking of which, we also had a generic Astartes chapter in round 3. This wasn't an Ultramarines list, it just didn't have a chapter keyword, just taking generic Ultramarines units. That allowed it to access that +1 to wound, which apparently wasn't enough because it also got 20-0'd. Following that up was a 20-0 win against Orcs, and that put Anthony into the finals for another big win against Eldari. That's a huge result for this brand new Grossmus detachment, and I think really a showcase of how hard these Chaos Space Marine melee can be pushed with this detachment. It's interesting too that it was able to scythe through a series of Space Marines, although most of them were not using the most updated version of Oaths of Moment, still taking faction-specific units, which then locks their potential +1 to wound. So with that, that's all I have to say about these lists. Let me know down in the comments section what you think about them and which one is your favorite. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.